Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is a built-in expectation of precision, right? Like you fall down, your arm hurts, you go to the hospital, and they put you in an x-ray machine.
Yeah, and that machine produces a definitive, objective image.
Exactly. You see that jagged white line on the black background, and the doctor just points to it. Broken. The evidence is physical, it's undeniable, and I think most importantly, it exists completely independently of how the doctor or the patient, feels about it.
Right, it's a binary state of reality. The bone is fractured or it isn't, and that objectivity provides a baseline of comfort, even in a really painful situation. We rely on that clear categorization to figure out the next step.
But the moment you step outside the realm of physical medicine and into the world of behavioral assessment or psychological diagnosis or institutional judgment, that x-ray machine just completely shatters.
It really does.
We are no longer looking at objective physical fractures. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky, heavily reliant on interpretation, and honestly, deeply vulnerable to the biases of the person looking at the chart.
Yeah, because the transition from objective fact-finding to subjective interpretation is perhaps the most consequential shift any system can make, because whoever controls the interpretation controls the outcome.
And what we are looking at today takes that very concept, the shift from objective evidence to highly subjective, murky interpretation, and applies it to the fundamental bedrock of our legal system. So welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
This is one of the most explosive, incisive, and frankly ultra-long texts we have ever covered. And because of that, I want to ask you, the listener, right up front, please like and subscribe to the channel. It is the single best way to help the show continue delivering these comprehensive deep dives into the controversial and complex ideas shaping our modern world.
And the source material on the table today is a very dense, deeply provocative 2026 ebook. It's titled Satanic Inversions of Gamma Bias, Category Creep of Feminist Jurisprudence.
A mouthful of a title, and it is authored by Conrad Riker. I highly urge you to open up Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to purchase today's subject material. It is fascinating, it is incredibly dense, and having it in front of you will really help you follow along.
Definitely.
Also, make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see how this conversation is evolving in real time.
To give you a sense of the scale and target of this book, Riker is writing a forensic, what he explicitly calls a red-pilled analysis, directed at men's rights activists and the broader manosphere.
Right.
The core of his thesis is that modern legal institutions, most specifically and destructively, the family court system, have not just drifted, but they have been actively captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Okay, I want to pause right here and set a hard boundary for you listening,
Yeah.
because this text contains incredibly politically charged content that strikes at the core of gender dynamics, law, and family.
It's very intense.
Extremely. So, because this text contains such highly politically charged content, we want to be crystal clear. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we condemning them.
Right.
Our mission today is to act as your guides, impartially unpacking the ideas and arguments exactly as they are laid out in the original source material, so you can understand this perspective for yourself.
And that architecture is built on a very specific premise. Riker's entire argument hinges on the idea that the family court system is not, a well-intentioned bureaucracy that occasionally fumbles or makes mistakes.
It's intentional.
Exactly. According to him, it functions exactly as it was designed to function, as a highly efficient extraction machine. He argues this system was engineered to statutorily sever a father's natural authority over his children and his household, while simultaneously turning his biological duty to provide into a monetized, state-enforced revenue stream.
So if this welfare paramountcy strips a father of his decision-making authority, what is his actual function in the eyes of the court? Is he just reduced to a walking ATM?
Basically, yes, under Riker's framework.
To answer that, we have to look at the historical shift in family law that Riker points to. From there, we'll dive into the psychological concept he calls gamma bias, explore the immense controversy surrounding the Duluth model, break down the cold financial mechanics of modern divorce, and finally, look at the radical proposed solutions for men navigating this system.
It's a huge roadmap.
It is. Let's start with the baseline. To understand why the author is so furious at modern courts, we have to understand what his baseline is for how things used to be.
Right, so Riker points us directly back to English common law. specifically citing William Blackstone's 1765 commentaries on the laws of England.
Okay, 1765.
Yeah. And for Riker, this isn't just a history lesson, it is a philosophical baseline of Western civilization. In Blackstone's legal framework, a father's duty to provide for, protect, and educate his household was fundamentally inseparable from his natural authority to govern that household.
I think we need to drill down to that word inseparable. He's saying that the responsibility to pay for the roof over a child's head was biologically and legally fused to the right to make the rules under that roof.
Fused is the perfect word. Riker emphasizes that in this common law tradition, authority wasn't a privilege granted by a judge or some state bureaucrat.
Right.
It was a natural right that preceded the existence of the state itself. Duty and authority were two sides of the exact same coin.
Meaning, if society demanded that a man lay down his life, his labor, and his resources for his family, society reciprocally recognized his absolute authority to direct that family.
Precisely. But Riker's central historical claim is that the state stepped in with a hacksaw and deliberately cut that coin in half.
Okay, how so? What was the mechanism for that?
He identifies a structural break executed across two major pieces of 20th century legislation in the UK, which had parallels all across the Western world.
Oh, interesting.
The first blow, according to the book, was the Family Law Reform Act of 1969. On its face, this act abolished the common law distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children.
Okay, I can hear the listener thinking, well, that sounds like a good thing.
Right.
Why should a child suffer legal penalties just because their parents weren't married?
And Riker actually concedes the humanitarian packaging of the law.
Right.
But he argues we have to look at the hidden mechanism, the structural consequence. By removing that distinction, the state quietly dissolved the ancient legal equivalence between biological paternity and parental authority.
Because before, marriage was the key.
Exactly. Under common law, marriage was the contract that secured both. By dismantling that, the state began to decouple the biological fact of fatherhood from the legal rights of fatherhood.
Setting the stage for what he calls the knockout punch, which Riker claims was the Children Act of 1989, right? This is where he introduces the concept of welfare paramountcy.
Yeah, Section 1 of the Children Act made the child's welfare the primary paramount concern of the court in any dispute.
Again, playing the skeptic here.
Yeah.
Who on earth would argue that a child's welfare shouldn't be the most important thing?
Well, the objection Riker raises isn't about the desire for a child's welfare, it's about how the legal system operationalizes that word.
Okay.
He argues that welfare paramountcy completely replaced objective, evidence-based fact-checking with the highly subjective, unquantifiable preferences of judges and state welfare officers.
So instead of a court asking a binary objective question like, did this father commit a crime that warrants removing his children, the court now asks an open-ended subjective question like, what living arrangement do we, the state, feel optimizes the child's emotional well-being?
Yes. And in making that shift, Riker argues, the state quietly confiscated the father's inherent authority to decide his child's upbringing and transferred it to itself.
So the state became the superparent.
Exactly. It left the father only with the absolute legally enforceable duty to pay for an upbringing he no longer controls.
Okay, let's unpack this and ground it with an analogy so you listening can really feel the mechanics of this shift. According to the author's logic, it's like signing a contract to co-found and manage a business. You invest your life savings, then halfway through the venture, a government regulator steps in. They don't accuse you of fraud or embezzlement. They just decide that your co-founder's management style is better for the company's welfare. So the state takes away your right to make any business decisions, gives it to your co-founder, but still legally forces you to personally cover payroll under threat of prison.
That's a great way to look at it. Riker actually uses the term servitude to describe this exact dynamic. Imposing crushing duties without granting any corresponding authority is the historical definition of servitude.
Wow.
And to prove that this isn't just abstract legal theory, he dives into case law. The one that stands out starkly in the text is a 1991 case, Re H. A. Minor.
Yeah, this case is staggering when you read the details. Break down what happened here.
We are looking at a father with an entirely unblemished record. He has a stable, respectable job. He owns a mortgage-free home. He goes to court simply seeking interim contact with his child. And the mother objects to the contact.
Based on what evidence? Were there police reports, allegations of violence, neglect?
None whatsoever. Her entire body of evidence was that the idea of him having contact made her feel uncomfortable.
A feeling.
Yeah.
The entire legal defense was a subjective emotional state.
Riker hammers this point home. In any other domain of law, like a civil contract dispute or a property disagreement, subjective discomfort wouldn't survive 5 seconds in front of a judge.
Right, you can't dissolve a corporate merger because you feel uncomfortable.
Exactly. But in the family court, under the banner of welfare paramountcy, the judge accepted it as valid legal currency. The father was completely denied contact with his child.
And the most Orwellian part of that case study is what the state welfare report said about the father afterward.
Oh, yeah. The report cited the father's persistent insistence on seeing his child, his desire to exercise his paternal rights, as evidence that he had a controlling personality.
So the very desire to be a father, the natural instinct to remain in your child's life, is weaponized by the state as psychological proof that you shouldn't be allowed to be one.
Through Riker's lens, this isn't a glitch in the system. This is the system functioning perfectly to redefine traditional masculinity as a pathology.
Which forces us to ask a mechanical question about the system itself. If the law was intentionally rewritten to allow subjective rulings based on elastic concepts like welfare and comfort, how do judges actually make their decisions?
That's the million-dollar question.
If they're no longer weighing objective evidence of crimes, what specific filter are they using to process reality?
And this brings us to a fascinating psychological concept Riker introduces called gamma bias.
Yeah, I love how this is framed. It's like a rigged audio equalizer in a recording studio. Imagine a judge sitting at a mixing board. The slider labeled male distress is permanently glued to 0, no matter how loud the man screams. But the slider labeled female distress is maxed out so high that even a whisper of discomfort sounds like a blaring emergency siren.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize what Riker is talking about. He draws on the work of researcher John Barry to define gamma bias. It is a pervasive cognitive distortion that operates simultaneously on a societal and institutional level.
And it does two things at once, right?
It amplifies female distress as a systemic emergency, requiring immediate, heavy-handed state intervention, while it minimizes male distress and reflexively pathologizes male authority as an inherent threat.
It's a built-in institutional double standard for how we perceive the exact same human behaviors based entirely on the sex of the person behaving.
Riker challenges his readers to prove this to themselves using what he calls the sex swap test or the mirror test.
Okay.
He asks you to look at any standard family court scenario and reverse the genders.
Let's walk through one of those scenarios. Say a mother decides to withhold a child's medical records or school reports from the father. How does the system frame that?
Under the gamma bias filter, the system almost always contextualizes her behavior benignly. It is framed as setting healthy boundaries or acting on a protective maternal instinct, or perhaps she is just overwhelmed.
Now run the mirror test. The father hides the medical and school records from the mother.
The interpretation flips instantly to the punitive. It is no longer a boundary. It is formally labeled as coercive control, financial abuse, or isolation tactics.
The exact same action produces a completely inverted legal diagnosis.
Yeah, and Riker argues this environment creates a psychological nightmare for men, which he vividly describes as a Kafka trap.
Named after Franz Kafka's surreal bureaucratic novels, where the very act of defending yourself against an absurd charge is used by the authorities as proof of your guilt.
The family courtroom, Riker argues, has ceased to be a legal tribunal where evidence is tested. It has mutated into a therapeutic confessional where your psychological profile is being graded by agents of the state.
So what does this all mean for the guy walking into court? The author is basically saying that the traditional virtues of stoicism and preparation, things men are raised to value, are literally weaponized against them as proof of guilt.
Exactly. Let's look at how he describes the physical demeanor of a man in court. If a man walks into the courtroom and he is highly composed, his paperwork is organized, and he speaks with flat, logical precision, how does the gamma bias filter diagnose him?
The welfare officer's report will label his composure as cold manipulation, suggesting he is calculating and lacking in empathy.
Okay, so the man realizes stoicism is failing. He changes tactics. The next time he comes to court, he is visibly devastated. He is angry, he is crying, he is showing the raw grief of a father who is losing access to his children.
The trap snaps shut from the other direction. The report now labels him as volatile, unable to regulate his emotions, and therefore a risk to the mother and child.
Right, so what if he tries to protect himself procedurally? He meticulously documents every text message, every interaction, every pickup and drop-off, just to have an objective record to prove he isn't doing anything abusive.
Yeah, meticulous documentation is weaponized against him as evidence of surveillance behavior and, again, coercive control. Riker's point is that the traditional virtues of masculinity, stoicism, logical preparation, emotional control are actively criminalized.
Let's look at the specific case study he uses to ground this Kafka trap, the story of the London engineer.
Yeah, talk about that one.
This is a prime example of gamma bias institutionalized. The man in Riker's text was married for 14 years, had 2 children, and was a professional engineer. He arrived at a preliminary directions hearing incredibly well prepared.
Which you'd think would be a good thing.
Right. He understood the law, he had his documentation categorized, and he was highly articulate in presenting his case for 50-50 shared care.
In any standard legal setting, competence and preparation recommend a litigant to the judge. It shows respect for the court.
But the CAFCAS officer, the Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service in the UK, viewed his competence through a heavily biased lens. The officer actually cited a 2019 Women's Aid briefing in their report, using it to frame this father's legal literacy and articulate presentation as an intimidating form of coercive control.
Let that sink in. Because he knew his legal rights, could express them clearly, he was formally deemed a psychological threat to his ex-wife.
The material consequence of that framing was devastating. The father was stripped of standard custody and reduced to supervised contact.
Wow.
He was allowed to see his own children for 2 hours a fortnight at a sterile contact center. He had to pay £80 per session for the privilege.
Wait, so he had to pay £80 just to be monitored?
Yes. And while he played with his kids, a youth worker with a clipboard sat in the corner, literally monitoring him to check if he displayed excessive emotion or insufficient emotion.
It is a perfectly closed loop of insanity. You cannot win because the rules of the game change dynamically depending on your reaction to the rules.
Yep.
If individual judges and social workers are operating with this gamma bias, that's bad enough. But Riker argues this isn't just individual prejudice. He claims this bias has been codified into the actual training manuals and operational frameworks of the entire system.
Which brings us to the most fiercely debated institution in Riker's book, the Duluth model. If gamma bias is the software running in the background, the Duluth model is the operating system installed on every computer in the family court network.
I saw the Duluth model mentioned repeatedly in the sources, and frankly, as a layperson, my initial assumption was that it was just a standard, universally accepted anti-domestic violence program. Why does Riker view a program explicitly designed to stop domestic abuse as a malicious weapon?
To understand his hostility toward it, we have to look at its origins and its underlying philosophy. The Duluth model was created in 1981 in Duluth, Minnesota by activists Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar. It rapidly became the dominant domestic violence intervention curriculum, not just in the United States, but it heavily influenced protocols in the UK, Australia, and across the Western world. Riker attacks it fundamentally because he argues it is a Marxist-inspired curriculum masquerading as objective psychology.
Marxist in what sense? When people hear Marxism, they usually think of economics, right? Like capitalism versus the proletariat. How does that apply to a domestic violence framework?
Riker argues the creators of the Duluth model simply took Marxist class struggle dynamics and copy-pasted them onto gender dynamics.
Oh, I see.
In traditional Marxism, you have the oppressor class, the bourgeoisie, and the oppressed class, the proletariat. The Duluth model frames domestic violence exclusively as a tool of patriarchal control. Men are categorically the oppressor class, and women are categorically the oppressed class. Therefore, all domestic violence is interpreted through the lens of male power and female subjugation.
And the philosophical mechanism they use to justify this is something called standpoint epistemology. We need to break that term down for the listener because it sounds incredibly dense, but its real-world application is terrifyingly simple.
It really is. Standpoint epistemology is the philosophical belief that objective truth doesn't really exist, or at least it isn't as important as subjective experience. It argues that truth is determined by the social position, the standpoint of the speaker.
So, because women are structurally viewed as the oppressed class in this ideological framework, a woman's subjective, lived experience of fear is treated by the court as objective, irrefutable truth, regardless of physical evidence.
Exactly. The Duluth framework effectively dictates that female aggression, even if she physically initiates violence, must be contextualized as reactive. It is framed as a survival mechanism or a desperate attempt to reclaim agency from her oppressor. Conversely, if a man uses self-defense, or even if he just raises his voice, it is viewed as an escalation of his inherent power and control. Riker points to the model's famous power and control wheel, which is used in courtrooms globally.
And what does he say about the wheel?
He notes with intense frustration that the wheel entirely omits any categories for female-specific forms of aggression, such as maternal gatekeeping, false allegations, or reputational destruction.
But Riker doesn't just attack this philosophically. He brings a massive amount of empirical data to try and shatter the Duluth framework, right?
He relies heavily on empirical counterarguments. He cites foundational sociologists and researchers like Murray Strauss and Donald Dutton, alongside massive data sets from the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services.
What does that data actually show, contrary to the Duluth narrative?
Riker points out that this data shows robust, replicated, cross-cultural evidence of bidirectional violence in domestic relationships, meaning both parties are mutually aggressive at roughly equal rates. Furthermore, he cites child welfare statistics showing extremely high rates of biological mothers acting as the sole perpetrators of child abuse, physical neglect, and even filicide.
Okay, hold on. I can hear listeners screaming at their speakers right now. If a mother is genuinely terrified, or if there is any hint of domestic volatility, shouldn't a family court prioritize safety above all else? How does Riker justify wanting to dismantle safety protocols? Doesn't safety first make sense when children are involved?
It makes complete intuitive sense, which is exactly why Riker argues it is the perfect Trojan horse. He calls safety first the nuclear weapon of the family court system. He argues that by simply invoking the word safety, the system is allowed to suspend fundamental due process.
How does that work in practice?
Well, in a normal criminal court, if you accuse someone of abuse, you have to provide evidence, and the accused has the right to cross-examine you or your evidence.
That's basic law.
Right. But in family court, under the Duluth-inspired safety-first doctrine, if a mother claims she is afraid of the father, the court often dictates that subjecting her to cross-examination or rigorous evidence testing would re-traumatize her.
So the normal rules of evidence just evaporate. Uncorroborated, untested fear is transmuted by the court into legal fact.
To illustrate how twisted this becomes, Riker provides a highly detailed hypothetical scenario based on common police responses.
Right, here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Walk us through that scenario.
So a domestic argument escalates. The female partner picks up a heavy glass tumbler and throws it at the man's head in front of their child. The man does not retaliate. He maintains his composure, steps back, and calls the police.
He does exactly what society tells a civilized person to do. He relies on the authorities.
The police arrive. The woman, realizing the gravity of what she's done or simply overwhelmed by the adrenaline, is highly distressed, hyperventilating, and crying. The man is standing there, calm, giving a flat, factual report of the assault.
And under the Duluth framework, how do the police and the courts process that scene? Riker claims that the system, trained by Duluth, will look at the man's calmness not as restraint, but as chilling, psychopathic control, right?
Yes. The fact that he called the police is framed not as seeking help, but as him weaponizing state power to intimidate and control a vulnerable woman. Her physical violence is completely erased by her emotional distress, and his stoicism is criminalized as a symptom of patriarchal dominance. He might be the one removed from the home, despite being the victim of the physical assault.
It is a terrifying inversion of reality, but it begs a massive structural question. How does a system like this operate in broad daylight? How do you suspend due process, ignore physical evidence, and rewrite reality in a Western liberal democracy that has a constitution? How does this not get struck down by the Supreme Court instantly?
That is the pivotal transition in Riker's book. He argues that the Duluth model and gamma bias are sustained by a very specific, overarching legal philosophy that provides them with ideological cover. He blames the ascension of feminist jurisprudence.
He specifically targets highly influential legal theorists like Catherine McKinnon and Robin West. But what I found genuinely surprising in a text aimed at the manosphere is that Riker doesn't just resort to ad hominem attacks, he actually Steelmans their argument first.
It is a crucial rhetorical and intellectual move. To dismantle a theory effectively, you have to prove you understand its strongest points. Riker concedes that the historical diagnosis provided by early feminist legal scholars contained valid, undeniable truths.
He acknowledges the reality of historical disadvantages for women.
Yes. He explicitly names coverture laws, this centuries-old legal doctrine where a woman's legal rights and property were entirely subsumed by her husband upon marriage.
He admits that the law is not this pure, neutral, perfectly balanced scales of justice entity. It was built by men, and historically it encoded private prejudices and protected male economic interests.
He grants them that historical reality, but, and this is the pivot he argues, that the fatal flaw of feminist jurisprudence was taking that accurate historical observation and converting it into a permanent, unalterable structural premise for all future law.
Explain that mechanism. How does a historical observation become a permanent structural flaw?
Feminist jurisprudence, in Riker's view, insists on treating all male authority forever as presumptively oppressive.
Okay.
Even more radically, it views the core structures of Western law itself, the presumption of innocence, the demand for strict empirical evidence, the adversarial testing of claims, not as tools of justice, but as the very machinery of male oppression designed to silence women. Therefore, to achieve justice, those structures must be dismantled or bypassed.
And he makes a really sharp, counterintuitive point here about how this philosophy actually degrades women.
Yeah, he argues that if you construct a legal system based on the premise that women can only ever be victims of male power, or that their bad behavior is always just a reaction to male oppression, you are fundamentally infantilizing them.
You are stripping women of moral agency.
Exactly. You are legally denying that women are fully actualized human beings capable of malice, manipulation, strategic calculation, or unprovoked cruelty.
So, if feminist jurisprudence believes the old constitutional rules are tools of oppression, how do they actually bypass them in modern family courts? Because the Constitution is still the supreme law of the land.
This is the sleight of hand Riker calls the constitutional exception. He points out that family courts routinely, almost casually, ignore massive constitutional and human rights precedents. For example, he brings up Troxel v. Granville, a landmark United States Supreme Court case that heavily defended fundamental, constitutionally protected parental rights against unwarranted state interference.
And in Europe, he cites Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Right, which explicitly guarantees a citizen's right to respect for their private and family life, barring severe evidence-based justification for state interference. These are heavy-hitting, foundational legal precedents.
But according to Riker, the family courts treat these supreme laws as, what, mere suggestions?
He calls them decorative footnotes. Family courts bypass the rigorous, objective evidence required by constitutional protections by hiding behind that highly subjective, elastic phrase we discussed earlier, the best interests of the child.
Ah, right.
If a judge or a welfare officer claims that an intervention like stripping a father of custody or forcing a mother to relocate is for the subjective welfare of a child, the normal constitutional rules of evidence simply evaporate.
Now, why should you, the listener, care about the abstract legal theory of feminist jurisprudence? Because, as Riker brutally illustrates, this academic theory doesn't stay in the university. It translates directly into material devastation.
It becomes reality.
Exactly. This theory is the exact mechanism that explains a 2018 Ministry of Justice statistic Riker cites, showing that the family home goes to the mother in roughly 70% of cases involving children. Academic theory is transmuted into your monthly bill.
Which leads us out of the realm of psychology and legal theory and directly into the cold, hard financial reality of the system. Riker is incredibly blunt in this section. The family court is not a justice system adjudicating disputes. It is operating as a transaction desk, executing a state-mandated payment plan.
He calls it financial erasure, the taxation of fatherhood.
To prove this, Riker dissects the legal framework governing divorce settlements, focusing heavily on Section 25 of the Matrimonial Causes Act 1973 in the UK, which has equivalents in many U.S. states. This section gives judges incredibly wide latitude to divide property and assets based on the concept of needs.
But needs is another one of those elastic, subjective words, just like welfare.
Precisely. Riker argues that in practice, needs are almost exclusively modeled around maintaining the mother's anticipated or desired standard of living. In doing so, the court completely erases the father's contribution. It ignores his decades of labor, the physical toll on his body, the sacrifices he made to build that wealth, and his own future need for housing and stability.
He uses the example of a Manchester general practitioner, a family doctor, to make this arithmetic painfully, brutally clear. Let's break down those numbers for the listener because they are staggering, and they show exactly how the system mathematically dismantles a man's life.
Let's look at the math Riker lays out. We have a couple married for 18 years with 2 children. The father is an NHS doctor. Over those 2 decades of high-stress work, he purchased and paid down a family home worth £620,000.
Okay, so a decent amount of equity.
Right. He also built up a substantial NHS pension. The marriage breaks down, and they enter the family court for a financial remedy.
And remember, Riker notes there is no finding of fault here. No domestic violence, no hidden assets, no extreme behavior, just a standard divorce. What does the transaction desk order?
The court orders the immediate sale of the £620,000 home. It directs a massive 72% of the proceeds to the ex-wife, citing her need to rehouse herself and the children in a manner she is accustomed to.
70%.
Yes. Next, it looks at the NHS pension the father built over his career. The court splits it, transferring 45% of its total value to the ex-wife. And if that wasn't enough, he is ordered to pay £2,400 every single month in ongoing maintenance and child support.
So let's look at the material reality of this ruling. The ex-wife takes her 72% and buys a comfortable 4-bedroom house. What happens to the doctor?
The doctor, stripped of his capital and facing a £2,400 monthly liability, is forced to move into a small, rented flat. And the psychological kicker, the true Kafka trap of this scenario, happens when he applies for overnight contact with his children.
What does the court say?
The court delays the overnight contact, arguing that the children need time to settle into their new home, the very 4-bedroom home the father just paid for by liquidating his life's work.
That is just wow.
The court extracted over £500,000 of wealth from him, reduced his living standards to a rented flat, and then used that disparity in housing to justify minimizing his role as a father. Riker calls this a standard financial remedy.
It is breathtaking. And Riker doesn't just stop at the individual tragedy. He extrapolates this financial arithmetic to the macro-societal level. He claims this entire structure isn't just about enriching ex-wives. He argues that child support and asset extraction are essentially the state's covert way of funding its own sprawling bureaucratic apparatus.
This is a deeply cynical but fascinating economic argument. Riker points out that the modern family court ecosystem is massive. You have domestic violence advocacy services, child support enforcement agencies, armies of court-appointed therapists, CAFCAS officers, social workers, and specialized family lawyers.
Right.
That entire ecosystem draws funding, state grants, and billing hours that are directly proportional to the dollars extracted and the level of ongoing conflict.
Meaning if the conflict ends, the funding dries up.
Exactly. If fathers simply retained 50-50 custody by default and kept their own wealth to build 2 equal households, the massive bureaucracy would shrink overnight. Therefore, Riker argues, the system is financially incentivized at a structural level to demote the father to a mere funding source and to keep the dispute as active, adversarial, and prolonged as possible. The state feeds on the friction it creates.
Okay, we have walked through the historical severance of duty and authority, the psychological rigged equalizer of gamma bias, the institutionalized Marxist theory of the Duluth model, the constitutional bypass of feminist jurisprudence, and the brutal mathematical reality of financial extraction.
It's a lot.
It's heavy. If you are a man listening to this, or anyone who cares about a man going through this, it paints an incredibly bleak, almost insurmountable picture of a hostile state apparatus.
It does. But Riker doesn't end the book in despair or nihilism. The final segment of our deep dive focuses on what he actually tells his readers to do about it. Segment 6 is all about prudence, justice, and the new institutional order. He provides a concrete counter-strategy.
So what does this mean for the listener? His very first piece of practical advice is behavioral. He tells men, stop apologizing.
Yes. This is crucial for surviving the Kafka trap. He tells men to stop submitting character references from their bosses or neighbors. Stop trying to explain your tone of voice to a social worker. Stop arguing on the court's therapeutic terms.
Because if you play their game, you validate their premise. If you act like a psychiatric patient desperately trying to prove you are sane to a doctor who has already pre-diagnosed you as sick, you have already lost the frame.
Precisely. Riker says men must shift from a defensive therapeutic posture to an offensive empirical posture. He advocates for the construction of what he calls a data wall.
What does a data wall look like in practice?
It is the relentless, emotionless accumulation of objective reality. Time-stamped evidence, uneditable communication logs, pediatrician attendance records, GPS data. He tells men to walk into court and immediately file position statements citing supreme law, specifically Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights and Section 6 of the Human Rights Act 1998, or their local constitutional equivalents.
So instead of pleading that you are a good dad, you force the court into a corner. You demand that they specify in writing on the permanent record exactly what statutory provision and what objective empirical evidence gives them the jurisdiction to interfere with your fundamental right to family life.
You force them to put their subjective bias on the record, which makes it appealable. But Riker acknowledges that legal tactics are just a bandage. His ultimate solution goes far beyond surviving a single court case. He argues for a massive, broader cultural shift.
Okay.
He says men must realize that petitioning corrupt, captured institutions is a fool's errand. Instead, they must start building parallel institutions.
This is where he brings in some fascinating historical and modern analogies that really elevate the scope of the book.
Yeah, if we zoom out and connect this to the bigger picture of how civilizations change, Riker compares this strategy of parallel construction to the early Christians living under the hostile Roman Empire. The early Christians didn't waste their time petitioning the Roman emperor for fairer treatment in the Colosseum or a more unbiased Roman Senate.
They realized the system was entirely captured against them.
Right, so they built parallel networks. They built their own charities, their own underground hospitals, their own educational structures. They operated entirely outside imperial control, relying on internal trust and shared values, until their parallel system simply outcompeted and outlasted the decaying Roman one.
And he updates that analogy for the digital age by comparing this strategy to Bitcoin.
It's the exact same ethos. Satoshi Nakamoto didn't petition the Federal Reserve to be more transparent or ask central banks to stop inflating the currency. He recognized the legacy financial infrastructure was broken by design, so he built a parallel, trustless monetary system entirely outside the captured banking infrastructure. Riker is telling men to apply this exact cypherpunk mindset to media, law, and community support.
Which brings us to the rise of the manosphere itself as a parallel institution.
Riker points to the explosion of independent media, long-form podcasts, and Substack newsletters as proof that this parallel construction is already well underway. He cites Cassie Jay's 2016 documentary, The Red Pill. Jay was a feminist filmmaker who set out to investigate the men's rights movement, ended up empathizing with their core arguments, and faced massive institutional backlash and deplatforming for publishing it.
She had to go outside the legacy distribution models to get the film seen.
Exactly. Riker also cites Warren Farrell's foundational work on the boy crisis and the massive societal ramifications of the fatherlessness epidemic. Riker argues that these alternative channels, these parallel networks of information, allow men to bypass the legacy gatekeepers of mainstream academia and media.
Thanks, Sam.
It allows them to share legal strategies, crowdsource funds, and articulate the reality of their lives without having their words filtered through a hostile, gamma-biased lens.
So, bringing it all back down to earth, what does this ultimately mean for you, the listener? Whether you agree with Riker's radical premise or not, what is his final call to action? He's essentially saying, withdraw your compliance from systems that hate you. He's asking men to recover Aristotelian virtues, prudence, justice, courage, temperance, to survive the procedural abuse without breaking character.
He breaks them down specifically. Prudence is the ability to act strategically and rationally, not emotionally, when the state provokes you. Justice is the absolute demand for fair, objective treatment based on evidence, not gender. Courage is the willingness to speak forbidden truths and risk social ostracization to protect your children.
And temperance.
And temperance, which is the incredible psychological restraint required to survive years of procedural abuse and financial extraction without breaking character or resorting to the violence the system expects from you.
He wants men to survive this system without letting the system's diagnosis define their reality. It is a profound, demanding call to individual fortitude and collective rebuilding.
Well, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground today.
We really have. To summarize this intense, exhausting journey through Conrad Riker's Satanic Inversions, we started by looking at his foundational argument that modern family law statutorily severed a father's natural authority from his biological duty. We explored how the psychological equalizer of gamma bias and the Marxist-inspired Duluth model create a Kafkaesque courtroom environment, an environment where a father's calm composure is deemed a threat, and a mother's uncorroborated fear is treated as undeniable legal evidence.
We unpacked how feminist jurisprudence provides the ideological cover necessary to bypass constitutional rights, effectively turning the family court into a multi-billion-dollar financial extraction machine.
And finally, we looked at his cypherpunk-inspired call for men to build parallel institutions and reclaim classical virtues to survive it all. It is a relentless forensic audit of a system that millions of people interact with every single year, viewed through a lens that completely and utterly inverts the mainstream narrative we are fed.
And as a reminder, our job today was to act as an impartial mirror. We are exploring the deeply controversial and provocative arguments of this text to give you a clear window into this specific worldview. We are leaving it entirely to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence, the case law, and the logic presented today.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder. based on the logical endpoint of Recker's thesis.
If Recker is entirely right that the state has legally severed a father's authority and that the state has assumed the role of the ultimate superparent via the doctrine of welfare paramountcy, what happens to the very concept of the traditional family in 50 years?
Well, yeah.
Does the family cease to be a natural biological unit that precedes the state? Does it simply become a temporary state-licensed project, one that is heavily taxed, intensely monitored, and easily dissolved the moment it stops serving the state's therapeutic or financial goals?
A very heavy structural question, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. It is the only way we can keep doing this kind of intensive, long-form work. Head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Satanic Inversions of Gamma Bias Category Creep of Feminist Jurisprudence so you can read the case studies for yourself. And I highly urge you to check out the author's continued work and community building by following @ConradNewreicher on Substack. We'll see you next time, and remember, sometimes the X-ray machine itself is what needs diagnosing. Take care.